When I heard those words, I felt something in my chest crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the slow, grainy sound of old wood giving way under pressure. I was standing in my kitchen, the morning sun spilling over the counter like it had on 100 quiet days before. And yet everything went dim around the edges, as if the world itself needed a moment to understand what had just been spoken aloud. I am 82 years old, or at least that's the age my body insists on when I bend to pick up a dropped spoon. But my mind, my memory, my awareness, they have never seemed fragile enough for someone to bury me while I was still breathing. I live alone in a small brick house that creaks in the winter and keeps secrets in the summer. It's modest, nothing fancy, but it has been a faithful witness to the afterlife I built when my daughter drifted away, one year after another, until the silence between us was no longer a gap, but a landscape. For a long time, I told myself that distance was normal, that children grow into new lives like snakes shedding old skins, and maybe there wasn't room anymore for the woman who raised her. I tried to believe she simply got busy, overwhelmed, tangled in her own responsibilities, and that someday she would remember me in a way that wasn't obligatory. But hearing that sentence, hearing that people had been told I was dead, that my daughter had spoken about me in the past tense as if closing a door, shattered every comforting lie I had once woven to protect myself. Kieran's voice was shaking when he repeated it. "Grandma, they said you died. They said it happened a long time ago." I could almost picture him sitting on the edge of his bed, the phone in his hand, trying to piece together the mismatch between the living woman he was talking to and the ghost he had been taught to accept. I steadied myself against the counter, my fingers pressing into the cool marble, and said his name once, slowly, not to calm him, but to anchor myself. I asked who they were, though I knew before he said it. There are truths you feel in the marrow, quiet but unmistakable, and this one had been forming for years, an ache I avoided touching. When he whispered, "Mom did," there was no surprise left in me, only a long descending sorrow that settled into my bones like winter cold. It's strange how betrayal from your child does not erupt like fire. It sinks like sediment, heavy and soft, making it harder to breathe but never giving you the spectacle of flames to blame. I sank into the nearest chair, letting his words move through me, not fighting them, not arguing, because sometimes the truth demands stillness rather than resistance. I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the careful pauses, the uncertainty of a young man torn between loyalty and disbelief. He told me he had found an old photo album tucked behind a row of board games in the hallway closet, photographs he had never seen, family moments he didn't recognize, and when he asked his mother about me, really asked, not the passive way children do, she stiffened, turned her face away, and told him I had passed long ago, before he was old enough to remember. She even gave a year. She even gave a cause. She built a story around my absence, polished it, repeated it, lived inside it, until it became easier to maintain than to dismantle. I listened as he explained how he hadn't believed her entirely, how something felt wrong, how he had waited until he could call me without being overheard. His fear alone, having to hide a phone call to his own grandmother, should have told me everything. But the human heart is slow to catch up to the mind when the wound is this deep. I had lived so long excusing her distance that I had never let myself imagine her erasing me completely. I felt my breath tremble, but I kept my voice steady, because the last thing I wanted was to frighten him with my own unraveling. I told him I was here, alive, that I hadn't gone anywhere except into a quieter life. I told him none of this was his fault. He asked if I knew what they'd been saying. I told him no, though in truth I had sensed something was wrong for years. After we hung up, the silence in my kitchen shifted into something dense. The refrigerator hummed softly, the clock ticked on the wall, and even the dust motes seemed to settle in a different pattern, as if the room itself understood that a long-avoided threshold had finally been crossed. I stood there for several minutes, feeling not shock, because betrayal from family rarely shocks, it erodes, but the slow rising certainty that I could no longer remain where I was, surviving on distant memories and shrinking hopes. There comes a moment when self-preservation is no longer a passive act. It becomes a motion, a decision, a hand on a steering wheel. And in that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that I needed to move, to see the truth with my own eyes, to find the child who once clutched my fingers with unquestioning trust, and ask her how she learned to speak of me as though I were already in the ground. So I went to my bedroom, pulled the old suitcase from under the bed, the one with a zipper that sticks on the left side and still smells faintly of my late husband's aftershave. And I began to pack, not with panic, not with confusion, but with a quiet, steady resolve. I folded sweaters, tucked in socks, added the framed photograph of Kieran as a toddler with cake smeared across his cheeks, and zipped it shut with hands that shook only once. The road between my small town and the city where my daughter lives is 800 miles, a distance I used to think was a simple geography. But that morning, it became a pilgrimage into the underbelly of a family story I had tried for too long to make gentle. 800 miles to understand why my daughter preferred me dead, even if only on paper. 800 miles to reclaim whatever part of myself had been lost in her silence. 800 miles to meet the truth she had built in my absence, and to decide, finally, what I would do with it. It was somewhere around the third hour of driving, long after the familiar fields around my town had flattened into wide, indifferent stretches of highway, that the weight of what Kieran had told me finally settled with its full, honest heaviness. No longer softened by shock or held at bay by the frantic need to pack and move. I had stopped at a shabby rest area with a flickering vending machine and a map so faded its colors had dissolved into ghostly smudges. And as I sat in the car with the engine running to push back the early spring cold, I realized that this was the moment when the world I had known, quiet, limited, strangely comforting in its isolation, tilted in a way I couldn't write again. I stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, lit by the dashboard glow, and saw a woman who had been too patient, too forgiving, too willing to tuck her own hurt into neat drawers and close them before anyone else noticed. A woman who had convinced herself that silence was dignity and distance was independence, when in truth they had been slow, gentle permissions for other people to erase her. As I sat there with my fingers curled around the steering wheel, I replayed the memory that had begun all this years ago, a moment so small at the time that I brushed it aside, not understanding that some betrayals begin not with a blow but with a whisper. It was the afternoon of my 69th birthday, a day bright with brittle winter sunlight. My daughter Lila had called to say she couldn't make it this year because her husband's firm had an event, but she would make it up to me soon. She had said it lightly, quickly, as though I wouldn't hear the strain underneath. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Maybe it's better this way, Mom. The kids have school projects, and it's just a lot to explain." At the time, I didn't dare ask what needed explaining. because the answer might have forced me to see the cracks I had been avoiding for so long. Instead, I told her I understood, that she should take care of herself, that birthdays come every year, and family obligations are unpredictable. I thought that was the moment she began rewriting the story of who I was in her life. Someone optional, someone who belonged to a past she no longer wanted to acknowledge. But it wasn't until much later, sitting in that car with Kieran's trembling voice echoing in my ears, that I realized Lila hadn't just pushed me to the margins. She had plucked me out of the frame entirely. The truth hit me more cruelly when I recalled something that had seemed harmless at the time. A neighbor calling me years ago to say a letter addressed to Lila had been delivered to my mailbox by mistake. I opened my door to retrieve it, and for a moment I paused, my thumb running across the handwritten return address from her children's school. I didn't open it, of course. I wasn't that kind of mother. But I remember the sinking sensation that followed the realization that the school had never contacted me. Not once. Not even when grandparents were invited for annual events. But I didn't let myself think too much then. I simply took the letter to the post office and sent it along. Yet now, with the cold air from the cracked window brushing my cheek, I understood that day was one more stitch in the careful tapestry of omission she had woven, a subtle reconfiguring of her world, so that I existed only as a faint, inconvenient rumor. What pierced me most was not that she had told people I was dead, but that she had done it so seamlessly, with such practiced ease, that an entire decade had passed without anyone in her circle questioning a story that required almost no evidence. When someone wishes another person gone, they don't need elaborate lies. All they need is consistent silence and the right tone of dismissal. I had unwittingly made her task simple by living quietly, by not intruding, by accepting less and less contact, until it seemed natural that I might disappear entirely. I closed my eyes and let the truth spread through me with the slow ache of something thawing after a long freeze. I recalled the last time I had seen her in person, her polite stiffness, her eyes sliding past me to the clock on the wall, her quick assurance that she would call next week, though she never did. If I had asked then whether she still saw me as her mother, she might have answered yes out of habit. But her actions had been whispering the opposite for years. The realization brought no dramatic burst of anger, only a deep, hollowing sorrow that settled under my breastbone like a stone. As I sat in that parking lot with distant truck engines rumbling through the evening air, I understood something else with painful clarity. Kieran wasn't the first to discover the lie. He was simply the first to refuse to accept it. He told me on the phone, in a halting, shame-tinged way, that he had once asked about me directly when he was a child, but Lila had shut him down so quickly, so sharply, that he never tried again. She said it would upset Dad, he whispered, and that we shouldn't talk about sad things around the house. It made terrible, perfect sense. My daughter had wanted a clean story, a tidy narrative without the untidy blurs of real family history. And I, by staying quiet, had allowed her to starve the truth until it was brittle enough to snap. The knowledge settled like a catalyst inside me, a point of no return. I could not unhear what Kieran had revealed. I could not unknow that somewhere, in some house where I had once rocked Lila to sleep, my memory had been boxed up, labeled, and discarded. And so I turned off the engine, adjusted my seat, and pulled back onto the highway. Not with the blind fury of a wronged woman seeking confrontation, but with a deep, anchored resolve to face the world my daughter had constructed in my absence. I needed to see her eyes when she realized her ghost had learned to knock on the door again. I needed to understand what kind of loneliness could make a child choose her mother's burial long before death arrived. Above all, I needed to reclaim the story of my own life, even if it meant stepping into the ruins of the version she had built without me. Each mile that passed under my tires was a mile carrying me closer to the moment where truth and illusion would collide, and I felt strangely steady, as though my heart had decided that there is no age too late to rise from death, not the kind carved in stone, but the kind whispered behind closed doors. By the time I crossed the state line, the sky had folded into a tired gray, the kind that presses low on the horizon as if weighed down by unspoken truths, and the highway, once open and full of restless momentum, began to feel narrower, tightened by a strange sense of anticipation I couldn't quite name. I drove through towns that looked faintly familiar in that way. Places do when they resemble others you've passed through in your life. Corner bakeries with peeling signs, old churches hunched like aging animals, gas stations where a lonely flag trembled in the stiff wind. But each mile seemed to peel back another layer of illusions I had built over the years to survive my daughter's distance. I had always imagined that estrangement was something that arrives suddenly, like a door slammed in your face. But now, with hours behind me and many more ahead, I began to understand that it is usually a slow erosion, subtle and patient, wearing down the foundation one small disappointment at a time, until one day you wake to find the structure too fragile to enter. As I drove, I replayed countless small moments I had dismissed. Long pauses on the phone where Lila's voice turned polite but thin. Holidays where she would call a day late with the excuse of being overwhelmed. Invitations from me that were met not with outright refusal, but with a vague, "we'll see," which I pretended to believe even though she had stopped showing up long before her lies grew bold enough to bury me. These memories, once scattered and blurry, now lined up with painful clarity, and I felt the truth rising like a tide. She hadn't pulled away. She had carved herself free of me, inch by inch, while I concentrated on loving her enough to not notice. I made a stop at a small, nearly empty diner tucked beside an exit that looked like it led nowhere, the kind of place where truckers ate in silence and waitresses moved with weary efficiency. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old vinyl, and as I sat in a booth by the window sipping something too bitter to be called coffee, I caught my reflection in the glass. Softened by age, the lines around my mouth deeper than I remembered, my eyes holding a mixture of resolve and sadness that felt oddly appropriate for the moment. Outside, cars passed without slowing, each one carrying someone toward a life that made sense to them, and I felt a tightening in my chest as I realized how little I understood the life my daughter had built without me. I had pictured her home as warm, chaotic, full of the noise of children and the soft clutter of a lived-in space. But now, imagining her telling people I had died, I saw instead a carefully curated world, one that required the removal of anything that didn't fit its aesthetic or emotional palette, including her own mother. And with that realization came another, more painful one. I had helped her create that world by making myself smaller, by accommodating every shift in her tone, by stepping back whenever she seemed overwhelmed, believing I was giving her space, when, in fact, I was giving her permission to let me disappear. When I returned to the car and resumed driving, the sky had darkened into a deepening dusk, the headlights of oncoming cars flickering like distant stars, and the quiet inside the vehicle seemed to grow thicker. I remembered a time years ago when I had called Lila to share something joyful, a small promotion I had received even though I'd been close to retirement, and she had responded with a distracted hum, barely listening as she said she was late for an appointment. I had hung up the phone and told myself she was busy, that young mothers have little time for anything beyond their children. But now, looking back, I could see that moment for what it was. Another thread lifted gently from the fabric that bound us. She had begun trimming away the parts of me that did not serve the image she was crafting of her own life, one where she was perpetually in control, perpetually self-made, perpetually unburdened by the imperfections of the past. Mothers carry so many versions of their children: the helpless infant, the laughing toddler, the rebellious teenager. But children carry only one version of their parents, and sometimes that version is not benevolent but burdensome, a weight they decide they can set down whenever they choose. The road curved along a stretch of farmland, the silhouettes of barns rising like dark monoliths against the dimming sky. And I remembered something else, something sharper. A conversation with one of Lila's friends at a wedding years ago. The woman had said with a pitying smile, "Lila hardly talks about her family. You must live so far away." I had laughed it off, saying that Lila was independent, that she had always been self-sufficient. But even then the comment had stung, because I couldn't recall the last time my daughter had introduced me to someone with genuine warmth. I had become an obligation she carried lightly, if at all, appearing in her life like a seasonal decoration, brought out only when convenient. And the more I replayed these moments, the more I understood that the lie she told about my death had not sprung from nowhere. It had been cultivated, watered, prepared by a decade of emotional pruning until she could present my absence as a natural fact. By nightfall, my eyes had grown tired, and the hum of the tires on the pavement had become hypnotic, pulling me into a contemplative trance. I wondered whether Lila had convinced herself of the lie over time, whether she repeated it so often that it ceased to feel like deceit and instead became a kind of twisted freedom, a way of absolving herself from the guilt of neglect. Perhaps in her mind, it was easier to grieve a fictional death than to face the discomfort of a living mother whose continued existence complicated her narrative. I imagined her telling her children that I had been kind, that I had loved them, that I had passed peacefully long before they could remember, and something inside me tightened, not from anger, but from a profound sense of estrangement that stretched far beyond physical distance. It wasn't just that she had erased me, it was that she had replaced me with a version more convenient than the truth. As the road stretched on, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. Fear. Not fear of confrontation or of the truth I would find, but fear that I had been complicit in my own disappearance. I had stayed quiet when I should have insisted on being seen. I had accepted crumbs of attention instead of demanding the fullness of connection that I deserved. I had forgiven too quickly, softened too easily, and mistaken neglect for independence. And now, as I neared the city where she lived, the air humming with the distant glow of streetlights, I realized that this journey wasn't just about confronting her lie. It was about confronting the version of myself that had made her lie possible. The woman who had swallowed disappointment until it became a diet. The woman who had mistaken distance for respect. The woman who had gradually allowed her voice to dim until it was barely a whisper. And so, with the highway unfurling ahead and the night deepening around me, I understood that the quiet worsening of our relationship had been the true beginning of everything that followed. It had been the slow, deliberate turning of a key, locking me out of a life I had once been central to. She hadn't buried me outright. She had simply let the weeds grow high around my memory until no one could see me anymore. And now, after years of silence, I was driving not just toward her home, but toward the reckoning I had avoided for far too long. A reckoning born not from rage, but from clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives only when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. When I finally reached the city where my daughter lived, the morning light had barely begun to lift itself over the pale horizon, and the streets were wrapped in that quiet, early stillness that belongs only to places where people have not yet woken to their obligations. But even in that muted calm, I felt the pulse of something raw and unresolved stirring inside me. Something that had been dormant for years and now insisted on rising. I didn't drive straight to Lila's house. I told myself I needed a moment to breathe, to gather the fragments of myself that were scattered across the last 800 miles. But the truth was that I wasn't ready to look her in the eyes. Not yet. Not until I understood what remained of me beneath all the years of being slowly erased. So instead, I found myself in the parking lot of a small school, the kind with faded murals on the walls and a playground littered with the echoes of children's laughter, even when empty. And I sat in my car, staring at the brick building until the first hints of movement appeared, teachers arriving early, custodians finishing their shifts, a few buses rumbling into place like sleepy animals preparing for the day. I didn't know why I had come there, not consciously, but then I saw it. The sign with the school's name. The same name that appeared on several of the letters Kieran had mentioned. The ones that had been hidden from me. The ones that had never reached my hands or my mailbox because someone else had decided I no longer existed. I don't know what made me get out of the car, whether it was instinct or desperation or some quiet, stubborn thread of maternal courage, but I walked toward the school slowly, each step feeling both foreign and familiar, like I was approaching a life I had once known but could no longer properly claim. A group of students stood near the entrance, backpacks slung over one shoulder, their breath turning to mist in the morning chill. And as I moved closer, my pulse quickened with a trembling anticipation I had not felt in decades. I had no plan, no rehearsed words, only the simple, urgent need to see my grandson with my own eyes, to confirm that despite the lie told in my name, the bond between us, once the brightest part of my world, had not been entirely stolen. I stood. Then he appeared, emerging from the school building with a group of friends, taller than I remembered, his shoulders broader, his face marked by the first faint signs of adulthood. But the moment I saw him, I recognized something unchanged in the way he carried himself, the quiet sensitivity that had always been there, the gentle way he looked at the world. I felt my breath catch, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of seeing him alive and real and entirely separate from the lie his mother had wrapped around my memory. I called his name, not loudly, not urgently, just enough for the wind to carry it, and he froze, his head turning sharply, his eyes widening as though he had seen a ghost step out of the morning haze. For a softness that pierced me more deeply than any accusation ever could. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and he reached his hand through the bars, gripping my fingers with such careful tenderness that I felt my entire body steady itself. In that brief touch, something shifted, not just in me, but in the narrative that had been forced upon us both. I had come all this way expecting confrontation, expecting pain, perhaps even expecting rejection. But what I found in his gaze was something entirely different. An earnest, quiet hunger for the truth, for connection, for the piece of his history that had been stolen. He asked me why I hadn't come sooner, and I had no answer except the one that formed slowly, painfully, as I looked at him, because I had believed the story my daughter created, the one where my presence was somehow harmful or burdensome. And I had accepted that version of myself for so long that I didn't realize how much of my life I had surrendered. Standing there with his hand in mine, I felt the first fragile but undeniable return of a self I had not recognized in years, a self that refused to remain invisible. When the bell rang and he reluctantly loosened his grip, he asked if I would be here after school, and I told him yes, without hesitation, without fear, because for the first time since learning of my death, I felt the ground of my life shift into a new alignment. I watched him go, watched him pause twice to look back, as if reassuring himself I was still there, and not a figment conjured by longing. And in those glances I felt a clarity settle inside me, calm and resolute. I understood then that this journey was no longer just about confronting Lila or demanding answers. It was about reclaiming myself from the quiet corner I had been pushed into. It was about choosing to step forward rather than shrinking back, about allowing myself to exist fully even if my daughter had chosen to erase me. For years I had mistaken being graceful for being silent, and being patient for being passive. But standing outside that school, watching my grandson disappear into the building with new light in his eyes, I felt the first stirrings of a strength I had forgotten I possessed. I returned to my car and sat for a long time, letting the moment wash over me, the warmth of his hand lingering on my skin, the realization that no matter what Lila had done, she had not succeeded in severing the connection that mattered most. And in that stillness, among the scattered leaves and the rhythmic hum of early morning traffic, I understood that I was no longer simply traveling toward a confrontation. I was traveling toward a reclamation, a rediscovery of my place in a world that had tried to bury me. I straightened my shoulders, wiped my eyes, and turned the key in the ignition, not with dread, but with purpose. For the first time in many years, I was not waiting for someone else to decide my worth or my role. I was stepping into the truth with intention, ready to face whatever waited for me on the next street, the next door, the next breath. By the time the school day ended and the first waves of students spilled out onto the sidewalk, the light had shifted into a softer, almost golden haze that made the world look briefly gentler than it had any right to be. But gentleness was the last thing I felt as I stood near the fence again, my hands tucked inside my coat pockets, my pulse tapping a slow, uneasy rhythm that seemed to echo through the metal bars. I had spent the hours waiting in my car, watching the way the sunlight slid across the playground equipment and listening to the muffled sounds of children inside the building, each passing minute tightening the knot of tension inside me, because, even though the earlier encounter with Kieran had steadied me, I couldn't forget that there was a storm behind him, a storm shaped like my daughter. And the moment she realized I was here, alive, present, standing in the same city she had declared me dead in, she would come with all the force of someone trying to preserve a lie that had been carefully constructed over years. When Kieran finally emerged, scanning the crowd until his gaze landed on me with a mixture of relief and urgency. I felt that knot loosen slightly, enough for me to breathe again. But beneath that breath was a ripple of dread. Because behind him, not far behind at all, was the first shadow of the past catching up. He walked toward me quickly, almost too quickly, his backpack bouncing against him, his eyes shining with a nervous brightness that made him look both older and heartbreakingly young. He told me he had only a few minutes before his mother came to pick him up, and that she would be furious if she saw us together, which struck me more deeply than I expected, because it meant he had been living inside her version of reality for so long that even the simple act of speaking to his grandmother felt like an act of rebellion. He asked if we could meet later, somewhere quiet, somewhere she wouldn't see us, and I nodded, though a part of me felt a sharp and complicated ache at the idea of having to hide from my own child. As we spoke, I noticed him glancing repeatedly over his shoulder, as if expecting her car to appear at any moment. And then, as though summoned by fear itself, a sleek silver SUV pulled into the school driveway, its tinted windows catching a flash of sunlight like a blade. I didn't need to see her face to know it was Lila. I recognized the rigid stillness in the way the vehicle came to a stop, the sharpness in the posture of the driver, the tension that rippled through my grandson's shoulders as he muttered, "That's Mom." I stepped back instinctively, not out of guilt, but out of the raw awareness that seeing me would dismantle whatever narrative she'd been feeding the world, and I could already imagine the fury she would unleash to keep that narrative intact. But before I could fully retreat, the car door swung open and she stepped out, her frame stiff, her expression unreadable at first. But then her eyes found me, and something inside her seemed to constrict violently, as though she had been struck. For a moment she stood frozen, one hand gripping the top of the car door, her eyes widening with a shock so real it almost looked like grief. And then her features hardened into something sharper, colder, something that told me she had not prepared herself for this reality. Not the reality of my presence, but the reality of being caught in her own fiction. She called Kieran's name with a clipped urgency that made him pull his hand away from mine, not because he wanted to, but because he'd been trained to respond to that tone for years. She took a step toward me, hesitation flickering in her eyes for just a second. And then she asked, in a voice that sounded almost mechanical, "What are you doing here?" It was not the question of a daughter reunited with her living mother. It was the question of someone finding a door she had nailed shut, now standing wide open. I told her calmly that I had come to see my grandson, that I had the right to see him, and that I was here because I had learned about the lie she had been telling for a decade. Her expression faltered, the mask slipping for a heartbeat, revealing something raw beneath. Fear, maybe, or shame, or the memory of a self she no longer recognized. But she recovered quickly, drawing herself up with that brittle confidence she had, honed over years of controlling every narrative around her. She told me that I had no business being here, that I was confusing her son, and that I needed to leave before I made things worse. As if my simple existence were a threat to the delicate architecture of the story she had built. I saw in her eyes not only guilt, but desperation, the kind that comes from knowing that a lie, once cracked, begins to fracture faster than one can repair it. I wanted to speak, to reach out to her, to ask her why she had chosen to bury me rather than face me, but before I could, she turned sharply toward Kieran, her voice firm, almost harsh, telling him to get in the car. He hesitated, looking at me with a torn expression that broke something in me, and for a brief moment I felt a strange flicker of pity for my daughter, because I realized she was now fighting not just against me, but against the truth that her own child had begun to see for himself. She ushered him into the car, closed the door too forcefully, and then turned back to me with a controlled fury simmering beneath the surface. She told me to stay away, that I was only causing trouble, that after everything she had done to protect her family, I had no right to show up unannounced. I listened quietly. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that her anger was not rooted in hatred, but in fear. Fear that her children would discover what she had done. Fear that the image she had built for herself would crumble. Fear that she would have to confront the parts of our past she had chosen to amputate. She drove away before I could say anything more, the SUV disappearing down the street with a sharp acceleration that seemed to echo her urgency to escape the truth. I stood alone on the sidewalk, the sound of the departing engine fading into the late afternoon air, and felt a wave of sorrow rise inside me. Not the helpless kind that collapses a person, but the heavy, resolute kind that clarifies everything it touches. I knew then that this confrontation had only been the beginning, that the true storm had yet to break, because people who build their lives on a lie do not surrender quietly when the truth arrives at their doorstep. They fight, they scramble, they manipulate, and they attempt to reshape reality with an even fiercer grip. And sure enough, within an hour, my phone began to ring. Not Kieran, not even Lila, but numbers I did not recognize, calls I let go unanswered, until the fourth one revealed a voicemail from a man who introduced himself as her husband, speaking in a tone that tried to sound polite but was sharpened by an unmistakable warning. He said it would be best for everyone if I respected their boundaries, that Kieran was emotionally vulnerable, and that my sudden reappearance was destabilizing. He said they were willing to arrange communication under supervised circumstances, and that they wanted to avoid legal complications, a phrase so absurdly inverted that I almost laughed, because there was something painfully ironic in hearing the family that declared me dead speak of legal integrity. The messages grew more insistent, one from a woman I barely knew, an old neighbor perhaps, telling me that Lila had reached out in distress, alleging that I was causing a scene. Another from an unfamiliar number, warning that the police could be involved if I didn't respect their requests. It was all so calculated, so frantically orchestrated, that it only confirmed what I already suspected. My daughter wasn't trying to protect her family. She was trying to protect her lie. And beneath that lie, I sensed layers of unspoken wounds, fears she never voiced, stories she had rewritten so many times she no longer recognized the original. I remembered her childhood, the way she had always tried to be perfect, the way she flinched at disappointment, the way she couldn't bear to look weak. I wondered if somewhere along the way she had come to believe that acknowledging me, my flaws, my history, my presence, would somehow unravel the identity she had built for herself. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces shifted into a darker, more complicated arrangement. Perhaps she had told the lie once, impulsively, in a moment of frustration or shame, and then had felt trapped in it, forced to maintain the fiction because unraveling it would mean admitting that she had chosen convenience over compassion. Or perhaps it had been intentional from the beginning, an erasure born of resentment she had never dared to voice aloud. Whatever the reason, the lie had taken on a life of its own, and now, confronted with my undeniable existence, it was lashing back with all the force of something cornered. I spent the evening in a small motel, the kind where the walls are too thin and the blankets too rough, sitting on the bed with the window cracked open to let in the cool night air, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional door slamming in the hallway. I replayed the confrontation again and again, examining every detail, the way Lila's eyes darted, the tremor in her jaw, the fear disguised as anger. I felt a strange mix of grief and understanding, as though I were seeing not just the woman she had become, but the child she once was. The child who had always feared abandonment, who had always needed control to feel safe. But at the same time, I felt something firmer rising inside me, an unwillingness to retreat, a refusal to let her rewrite the truth of my life any longer. For years, I had let her distance dictate the terms of our relationship. But now, seeing her attempt to weaponize her fear into legal threats, I knew I couldn't step back. Not for my sake, and certainly not for Kieran's. Late that night, as I lay awake listening to the rhythmic buzz of a neon sign outside, I received one final call. A quiet voicemail from Kieran, his voice low and rushed, telling me he wanted to see me again, that he didn't care what his mother said, that he needed to know the truth. And in that moment, I felt the shift fully, the middle point of no return. The past was coming for me, yes, but so was the future, pulling me forward with the fragile but unwavering grip of a boy who refused to let himself be lied to any longer. And I realized that no amount of fear, no number of threats, no carefully constructed story could stop what had already begun. Because once truth starts to surface, even the strongest hands cannot keep it buried. The next morning arrived with a strange, almost electric stillness, the kind that settles right before something irreversible occurs. And as I stood in the doorway of the motel room fastening my coat, I felt a steady, measured resolve move through me, not fiery or dramatic, but calm in the way a long-dreaded truth becomes simple once you finally accept that it must be spoken aloud. The air outside was cool and sharp, carrying the faint smell of rain, and I walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the small law office I had found the night before. A brick building with narrow windows and a modest sign that looked as though it had not been changed in decades. It wasn't a place for theatrics or polished egos. It was the kind of office where ordinary people came to reclaim parts of their lives that had been taken from them. I entered quietly and spoke to the receptionist in a voice that no longer trembled, telling her I needed to speak with someone about identity, about false reporting, about being declared dead when I very much was alive. There was no shock in her eyes, which reassured me more than any sympathy could have. She led me to a small room with a wooden table and chairs that creaked as I sat. And after a brief wait, an older attorney with silver hair and a weathered face entered, introducing himself with a firm but gentle handshake that told me he had seen enough of human complications to know that most wounds are invisible and most truths are far more complicated than the law ever accounts for. When I explained everything, my daughter's claim that I had died, the 10 years of silence, the lies told to my grandchildren, the attempts to keep me away now that my presence threatened the structure she had built, his face shifted from professional neutrality to something like thoughtful concern. He asked for details, for dates, for any documentation I still had, and I reached into my bag with deliberate care and handed him the collection of papers I had carried all these years. The notarized deed that still bore my name, unopened letters had mailed to Lila that had returned with "moved" scrawled across them even though she had not moved, and a single photograph of Kieran and me, taken when he was 3 years old. A photo I kept not for legal reasons, but to remind myself of the bond that had once been unbreakable. The attorney reviewed each item with the quiet intensity of someone assembling a puzzle, and then he told me something that made the air in the room feel suddenly heavier. It was entirely possible that my daughter had used the claim of my death to facilitate decisions regarding property, family trusts, or school enrollment. All things that could have required my absence or silence. The lie might not have been merely emotional. It might have been practical, even strategic. I didn't want to believe that. But the more he explained how easily such omissions could be exploited, the more painfully clear it became that my disappearance had served more than one purpose in her life. He suggested drafting formal declarations, sending letters to relevant institutions, and verifying whether any legal actions had been taken in my name. I listened without flinching, my hands folded tightly in my lap, because I had reached a point where truth mattered more than the comfort of not knowing. He asked whether I wished to pursue formal action against my daughter, and I felt a long breath leave my body, slow and steady, as though I had been holding it for years. I told him I wasn't seeking revenge or punishment. I wanted clarity, acknowledgement, and the return of my own narrative. I wanted the official world, the world of records, documents, and signatures, to reflect the reality that I had lived through and survived. I wanted the freedom to reclaim myself without the shadow of her fabrication clinging to every step I took. He nodded, understanding more than I said, and together we drafted a series of letters, concise, firm, undeniable, that stated plainly that I was alive, competent, and in control of my affairs. The words leaving the office, I felt the world sharpen around me, colors brighter, sounds more present, and I walked without hesitation toward the address I had memorized long ago, though I had never entered the house that stood there. As I approached my daughter's home, a pristine 2-story structure with symmetrical windows and perfectly trimmed hedges, I couldn't help noticing how controlled everything appeared, as if even the landscape had been instructed not to grow in unexpected directions. I stood at the base of the walkway for a moment, letting my gaze travel across the facade, imagining the countless times she had told people I didn't exist anymore, building a life where my absence was not a tragedy, but a convenience. Then I stepped forward and rang the doorbell. The sound lingered in the air longer than I expected, a thin chime that seemed to ripple through the quiet street, and after what felt like a lifetime, the door opened, and there she was, my daughter, dressed in a muted sweater, her hair pinned back. Neatly, her expression a careful arrangement of shock, dread, and indignation. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes scanning my face as if searching for cracks, for some sign that I wasn't real, that she might still salvage the lie she had woven. But reality has a weight to it that no amount of denial can erase. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than the last time I heard it. A soft, trembling whisper that carried more fear than fury. She asked why I had come, what I wanted, why I couldn't let the past stay in the past. And something in her tone made me realize that she had convinced herself she was the victim, that my presence was a disruption to the order she had fought so hard to maintain. I stepped inside without waiting for permission, not out of defiance, but because I knew she wouldn't refuse me in front of her children, who were somewhere in the house. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon polish and something sweeter, maybe vanilla, and everything was arranged with an almost obsessive precision, a stark contrast to the home she grew up in, where warmth always took precedence over symmetry. She followed me into the living room, her steps hesitant. And once we were out of view of the hallway, she let out a breath that trembled with something raw. She said she didn't want to hurt me, that she had been trying to build a stable environment for her children, that she thought keeping things simple, clean, controlled, was the best way to do that. I listened, not interrupting, because beneath the justification, I heard an undercurrent of something far more vulnerable, a fear that if she let even one part of her story unravel, the rest would collapse. She said she knew she had made choices that were hard to understand, and that after a certain point, correcting the lie would have caused more chaos than sustaining it. She said she didn't know how to stop once she had begun, and that admitting the truth would have made her look unstable, dishonest, even cruel. She didn't want to be seen that way, not by her husband, not by her children, not by herself. And for the first time, I glimpsed the awful, disquieting logic behind her decision. She had chosen her image over her mother. When she finished speaking, her eyes glossy with unshed tears that never quite fell, I felt a calmness settle over me, a clarity that surprised us both. I told her that I had been alive for every minute of the years she had buried me, that I had waited for her to reach out, that I had mourned the loss of our relationship long before she pronounced me dead. I told her she could have come to me with anything, fear, shame, resentment, confusion, and I would have listened, because that is what mothers do, even when it breaks them. But she had chosen silence, and in that silence she had rewritten our history without my consent. I told her I was not here to punish her or expose her. I was here to reclaim what she had tried to erase. I handed her the letters from the attorney, watched her hands tremble as she read them, watched the blood drain from her face as she realized that her version of events was no longer sustainable, no longer protected, no longer insulated by secrecy. And then, unexpectedly, she whispered something so soft I almost didn't hear it. She said she didn't know why she did it, that it started with one small omission, and then another, until the lie seemed kinder than the truth. She said she didn't want her children to see the fractured relationship between us, didn't want them to ask questions she didn't know how to answer, didn't want to face the messy, complicated reality of who we had been to each other. She said she had convinced herself that if she could remove me cleanly, surgically, the rest of her life would fall into a neat, manageable order. She said she didn't expect me to ever show up again. For the first time in years, I reached out and touched her hand, not to comfort her, not to bridge the divide, but to mark the moment as real, undeniable, irrevocable. And as she sat there trembling beneath the weight of her own choices, I understood something that reshaped the entire moment. This was the end of the old story, the final unraveling of the lie, and nothing that came after. Reconciliation, distance, forgiveness, separation, would ever return us to the place we had been before she declared me dead. Something irreversible had happened, not because I confronted her, but because I had finally stepped out of the shadow of her silence and said, with my presence alone, that I existed, that I had always existed, and that no story built on fear could hold me down any longer. When the quiet street, with slow, unhurried steps, not triumphantly and not defeated, but with a kind of grounded clarity I hadn't felt in years, the kind that settles into your bones when you finally understand that the story you live through is no longer the story that controls you. The air carried the faint scent of cut grass and distant rain, and as I reached the end of the block, I paused to steady myself on a low iron fence, letting the enormity of the last few days wash over me. The drive, the revelations, the confrontation, the unspooling of a lie that had shaped a decade of my life without my permission. I felt no anger toward her now, only a deep, weary acceptance, as though the truth had finally completed its long, slow journey to the surface and no longer required my resistance or my grief. It simply existed, unchangeable and undeniable. For the first time in a long while, I felt the soft, unmistakable shift of reclaiming the space inside my own skin, of being someone whose life was not defined by absence, but by presence, even if that presence had been ignored, misrepresented, or buried by someone I once held as close as breath. I returned to the motel not with the heaviness I had carried before, but with a strange, quiet lightness that comes when you stop expecting the past to undo itself. And I sat on the edge of the bed with the window open, listening to the hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of the curtains, realizing that I no longer needed to rehearse what I would say or do next. The path ahead was no longer tangled with the need for explanation or justification. It was simply open. When my phone buzzed with a message, I didn't flinch. I already knew somehow whose number it was. Kieran had written only a few words, but they carried more weight than any apology or confession could have. "Grandma, can I see you tomorrow? Just me." The simplicity of it, the sincerity, the quiet courage behind the request. It loosened something in me that had been clenched for so long, I'd forgotten what ease felt like. I typed built up in layers I hadn't even acknowledged. Later, as the sky darkened into a deep velvet blue and the motel's neon sign flickered with its weary buzz, I thought about my daughter, not with bitterness, but with the kind of distant compassion you feel for someone who has been carrying a burden they didn't know how to name. I understood now that her lie had been less about malice and more about fear. A misguided attempt to sculpt a version of life she could manage, even if it meant cutting away pieces that mattered. But I also knew that understanding did not require me to excuse her, nor did it tie me to the hope that she would change. There was a freedom in that. The freedom of letting go without slamming the door, of stepping forward without dragging the past behind me like a heavy shadow. I realized that I didn't need her to rewrite the story she had told. I only needed to stop living inside it. And as strange as it sounded, there was a tenderness in that clarity, a softness that returned to me like a long-forgotten part of myself brushing against the present. When I finally lay down, pulling the thin motel blanket over myself, I thought of all the versions of me that had existed over the years. The mother who bent herself into shapes to keep the peace. The woman who waited by the phone. The ghost who lived only in the spaces others allowed. And now, the woman who had walked back into her own life with steady steps and a quiet refusal to disappear. I felt no need for grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. The truth had already done its work, carving out a new space in my life where I could stand without trembling. Tomorrow, I would see my grandson, look into the face that still held traces of the child I once held against my chest, and I would know that not everything had been lost, that some bonds survive even the deepest attempts to sever them. I closed my eyes and let that thought settle into me, the gentle promise of a continuity I had thought was gone. And before sleep finally found me, I whispered into the dim room, not to my daughter, not to the past, but to whatever part of me had waited all these years to be seen again. That sometimes surviving is not the act of holding on, but the quiet decision to no longer shrink for the comfort of others. It was a small truth, almost fragile, but it rested in me with a certainty I knew would not fade. And I hoped, in the softest, most private corner of my heart, that any woman who had ever been pushed to the edges of her own life might someday feel this same quiet return, this same gentle reclaiming of herself, as if waking from a long sleep to the simple, undeniable fact of her own continued existence.